guys, welcome to my build log. Today we're going to build a mid-range Intel platform paired with an RTX 3060. And if it's not yet obvious, we're going to use a Hyte Y60 for the case. Now do take note, this video is not a guide on how to build a PC. I'm only going to highlight the build step by step, and for the performance of the build, I'm going to show some gaming benchmarks later in the video. And if you want to build your own PC with the same specs, I'll link all of the parts I used below in the description. With all that out of the way, let's get started. For the motherboard, I went with an Asus ROG Strix B660A Gaming Wi-Fi D4. I chose this motherboard mainly because of its white and black aesthetics, colors that should complement our build. And at the heart of this build, I went with an Intel Core i5-12400F. Do take note, this is an F variant chip, meaning you need to have a discrete graphics in order to run it. As for the memory, I went with 32 gigs of black and white Corsair Vengeance 2x16 3600 MHz kits. It comes with RGB, which is fully customizable through Corsair's IQ software. For the storage, I installed 1TB of WD Green NVMe SSD. It's the perfect balance of price and performance. Now for the cool part. This build is gonna be cooled using an NZXT Kraken Z73 RGB, a liquid cooler that comes with a 360mm radiator and 3 pieces of NZXT's AER RGB fans. What's cool about this AIO is that it comes with a fully customizable LCD display in the pump block. Now for the installation of the radiator. Just remove the radiator mount at the top of the case, screw the radiator to the mount along with the fans, and you should be good to go. Onto the power supply. This build is powered by Seasonic's Focus GX850. It's fully modular and it's rated for 850 watts with an 80+ gold certification. To maintain the uniformity of the build, I went with an additional 3 pieces of NZXT AER for the case fans. It's fully RGB and is customizable through NZXT's Cam app. For the graphics card, I went with Gigabyte's RTX 3060 Vision. With its white color, clean and simple aesthetics, this GPU will surely complement any white build setup. Now with all this plastic out of the way, our build is ready to be showcased. it's time for us to do some benchmarks. Starting off with CSGO, a CPU-bound game. High settings were used at 1080p. The i5 12400F manages to utilize the RTX 3060 at about 90%, pushing at over 300 frames. Frame times are also low, hovering around 2 to 3 milliseconds. Next up is Escape from Tarkov. Now, Tarkov is known to be a CPU-reliant game, but it's also notorious for being an optimized game in general. With our setup tested in 1080p Ultra preset, it manages to get an average of 98 FPS on customs. Next up, Forza Horizon 5, an overall fairly optimized game. Our setup manages to pull over 100 FPS on 1080p Ultra settings. On Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the setup averaged 126 FPS on the highest preset in 1080p with the low frame time hovering around 7 to 8 milliseconds. On Horizon Zero Dawn, the setup managed to average around 85 FPS within the Frozen Wilds region, which is graphically taxing compared to the base game region, so expect higher FPS in the early parts of the game. Time for Red Dead Redemption 2. The game mainly relies on GPU resource. Our setup manages to pull over 60 FPS on the favor quality preset in 1080p using the Vulkan API. Next up, Monster Hunter Rise. Now do take note, this game was originally intended for console, and for a PC port, the game manages to utilize resources quite better than most games. Our setup manages to pull over 150 frames on average in the high settings in 1080p. And for our pirate-loving gamers out there, Sea of Thieves. Our setup manages to pull over 120 FPS on average in 1080p Mythical preset. On Cyberpunk 2077, the build managed to pull almost 60 FPS on the Ultra preset settings in 1080p. If you want to squeeze more FPS out of the game, just set the DLSS to quality and you can easily average 60 plus FPS. And now, for a personal favorite franchise, but sadly the devs destroyed it, Battlefield 2042. Now the game runs massively better compared to when it was launched. Our setup managed to pull over 80 FPS on average in Ultra settings in 1080p. For our final test, of course we're gonna test a game within the Call of Duty franchise, Call of Duty Vanguard. The game runs smoothly at over 100 FPS using Ultra preset settings in 1080p. So what do you guys think of the build? To be honest, this is the cleanest build I've ever done. As for the performance, I'd say it's about mid-range, competing with the Ryzen 5 5600X. Speaking of, if you're interested to see how the Intel i5 12400F stacks up against the Ryzen 5 5600, I'll link my test that should pop up in the screen right about now. For more in-depth gaming benchmarks on this setup, check out the channel where I test multiple games on different settings and resolution. That's all for now. If you liked the video, show some support by pressing the like button. It greatly helps the channel. As always, thanks for watching.